It's like with classical music. How would you say, I guess having all this experience with like really acoustic organic instruments, how has that influenced your take on production and mixing?
Sure. Well, I like to think that when a mix sounds good, it's partly because you're not thinking about the instruments or the mix. You're just sort of hearing the music. And I like to use the word natural to describe this experience. Like, it sounds natural, but I don't really mean natural as in high fidelity or real. I more mean kind of effortless. Like, you don't hear effort in the sound. And having to try to capture reality with sort of high resolution recording techniques and kind of the audiophile work that I've done, jazz and classical stuff, is particularly sensitive to fidelity. And like, a lot of players are very particular about their sounds. They really like push you to record them in a certain way that makes them feel good, right? That they feel that what they are expressing is coming through in the recording. So that experience kind of introduced me to the idea that you want to capture the sound with detail and clarity, but you also don't want it to sound sterile. And so there's a way in which I've brought this idea of naturalness, effortlessness into my approach now, where I'm working more so with pop music. And there, none of the sounds really are natural, so to speak. A lot of it's samples or synths or things like that. But I don't want to ever make something sound like it's being forced to be a certain way. I want it to feel organically. Like, I don't want the listener to ever hear that something's been done to the sound. Even when there's tons of effects, I want them to be like, oh, wow, what is that sound? Not like, what's that sound with delay and reverb and chorus and flanging,
So cool. I'm trying to think, is there like specific things that you don't do to make things like not sound sterile?
Well, I think partly it's about the ear training, and it's about not stopping when something is not delivering the results that you want. You really have to push through that. And sometimes what sounds natural to my ear is absurdly processed, like 10 plugins in a row, outboard gear. Sometimes to make something sound natural, you actually have to manipulate it substantially. And that's partly because recordings are really not real. They're not a reality. They're not a real representation of the sound. And so even you put like a $12,000, U47 in front of a sound, it might sound really good, but it may not sound like it needs to be, right? So I'm not shy about processing. I really don't have like any restrictions per se, but it really just has to be, the processing has to do something that I feel has value. I don't just process for processing's sake. I really want to get a lot of value out of each step that I do.
Yeah. So you have like a vision for what it should sound like, and it's just using tools until it sounds that way, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's really try to manifest the imagination.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're all doing, really, is we're creative people. We're taking something that's in our minds and we're making it more real in some way, whether it's a painting, a photograph, a film, a recording.
Yeah, that's totally it. And people that are like, on the up and up in this field, I feel like it's like, oh, they figured out how to like get the sounds they have in their head. It's not just about like tweaking with, presets or let's just throw this up and see what that sounds like. It's like, no, like you have an intentional sound that you're going for. How do you achieve that sound?
Yeah. And that becomes particularly important when other people are asking you to accomplish a specific result too. And probably, all the times, this kind of is a good segue maybe to what we were talking about earlier about the relationship between producer and mixer, because when I'm working with a producer on a mix, my role is to really help that producer communicate their vision. And, ideally I get to put a little creative spin on it as well, right? And people come to me because of my creativity and my taste and all that, right?
For sure.
But being able to interpret what the other person is saying and turn that into a technical process or a sequence of technical processes, right? With the outcome being this imagined creative result, that's really kind of like some of the most gratifying experience for me, honestly. It's like when you have that opportunity to help that along.
Yeah. I totally feel that. I love helping. I mean, I think this is why I keep doing it, is because I love helping people, get what they're going for. It's like, it's still their music, and you want them to be proud of it and love it. And if you're there to like hold their hand a little bit and like a little bit of guidance, and it gets them to where they need to go, it's like that's like the best feeling.
Definitely.
So how do you find artists these days to work with? Like, is it like word of mouth? Do you do some advertisements?
Sure. So it's a bit of a mixture. Prior to COVID, I was getting a lot of work through my website and search traffic, and people would find my studio website and they would be intrigued by the work that I've done, and they would be looking for a space to do a project. And because I'm one of the few remaining studios in Manhattan, I would actually capture a decent amount of traffic for people searching for studios in New York. And
that's amazing.
That has really worked for me substantially. Now, obviously, post-COVID, it's a little bit different. I'm leaning more on existing client relationships that I have. I'm working on repeat, new albums from people I've worked on prior projects with. And there's still some search business, but at the moment, it's very dry, to be honest. I think it's the whole music industry has been disrupted substantially. Musicians can't tour, they can't generate revenue. And for a lot of people, making a record was really just they were just making the record so that they could give it to a booking agent and say, look, I make music. Can you book my show? Because the economics.
Live was king.
Yeah, live was king. The economics of recordings, didn't really support speculative record making for a lot of people, except people who have a little bit more kind of like representation in the industry, so to speak. So some of it's search traffic, some of it's referral, some of it is, repeat business from people that I've worked with before. And in terms of advertising, I've not really done formal advertising. I've done like a few sponsored posts on Instagram or something here or there, mostly if I'm just kind of sharing something that's intriguing, hoping people might be interested in it. Like when I bought the SSL console in 2015, I was posting about that, hoping that people would be interested in working in a studio with a console, right? But I don't really have like an advertisement campaign. It's really just the density of search traffic and then kind of referral and the sort of, I'm not like at the level of like the greats, I'm definitely kind of like a mid-tier engineer in terms of like the kinds of people that are going to me as opposed to like Manny Marroquin. But there's a lot of people. There's a lot of people who are not the A-list, artists.
We're just working towards the A-list. That's all it is.
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully the people that we're working with now will have traction in their careers. And, over time, those relationships that you've developed with the people now, while they're also kind of they're maybe at the middle level of their career, we'll all be on the A-list in a few years.
Yeah. God willing.
Yes.
That's awesome. So your studio, so there are pictures on your website. I've never really seen a live room like this with, books and a piano. And you were telling me before we started the podcast about how things are changing, and it changed already. Like, tell me a little bit about the build of your studio, what it was, how that sounded, and why you're changing it and what you're changing it to.
Sure. So in 2012, when I expanded the studio space to be a actual live room and a control room, the control room space had been kind of building storage space. It was nondescript, and I did some panels from Real Traps and, kind of home treated it basically. The recording space, the live room, it had bookshelves on it already. It was kind of another storage space that the building was using. And I happened to, my parents are huge book fans, and my dad particularly is like obsessed with books, and he's accumulated a lot over the years, and he had nowhere to store them. They were getting out of control. So we put all the books in the shelves there, and it's a collection of about maybe 3,000 books.
Oh my God.
It's a lot of books. It's like a few decades. And it's also like my dad's books and my grandparents' books when they passed away. Like it's been my own books. I love books. Like it became like a big like
it's a library.
It's a library. It's a collective library of like many members of my family. And so it became kind of like, oh, here's this space. Like, let's put them there. Right. And so it really is great because it's such a cool texture, such a cool vibe. It doesn't feel like a recording studio with panels on the wall. It's a living room that's a book, covered in books. And I've maintained that. Even though I have completely rebuilt the space from scratch, I was very intentional about wanting to keep the books in the control room because that's part of the look of my space.
Yeah. Well, the books must have a tone to it, right? Like, I feel like they disperse the tone everywhere. It's probably very, I don't know. I'm not sure if it's live or dead. Like, what does it sound like?
It's a very literary tone. Yeah, it's a mixture. It's not completely reflective. They're reflective, but they are somewhat randomly reflective, and they're also somewhat absorptive. So it's a middle. It's not completely dead. To be honest, I'm not sure it's like a spectacular sounding ambience. Like it's not like a beautiful hall or like, one of these immaculate rooms. It just kind of sounds like a room. And it's not too long. It's not, not too short. It's kind of in the middle somewhere. And it kind of just works for most things. And I have a few gobos that I'll set up if I want to kind of deaden an area off a little more. And now I have a whole separate ISO booth, which I constructed. So there's that additional capacity.
Would you usually like record like a vocalist with the gobos and stuff, or would you like let them have the room? Oh yeah, you would get
mostly. I mean, if I've done some opera stuff where I would want to record them from further away, and having the little bit of distance in the space helped for that kind of repertoire. But for most vocal recording, I like it pretty dead to begin with. So I would set up kind of a dead sound field with some gobos, both behind them as well as behind the microphone, kind of like in a circle, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be so curious to hear what that piano sounds like with, just in that room, like just like the dead, like, sorry, not dead, but the, the raw tracks,
Yeah, for sure. I did a really cool project a few years ago, which was like jazz standards for a film score. And it just sounded like a club, like a kind of small, intimate club with all, it was piano, drums, bass, sax. Maybe there was guitar in there too, and it just had that kind of like small jazz club sound.
Yeah. Okay. Cool, man. That's awesome. Wait. So what happened next? So you took that down. You tore that down. You decided to.
Yeah. So I bought an SSL Duality in 2015, and it was the 2015 AES show console here in New York, and I installed this console at the end of the year in 2015, and
this is a totally analog console.
Yes, it's the SSL Duality is SSL's current flagship console. It's a modern console. It was designed in 2006, and it is a true analog console, full what they call super analog signal path. It has all the SSL processing on every channel, EQ, dynamics, filters, etc. It has an automation system too. But what's really special about the Duality is really the computer control of signal routing. Certain switches are computer controlled, and the recall of the console makes it viable for a modern workflow. So I can recall the entire console in about 15 minutes, and that means manually twisting all the knobs and adjusting certain switches, but a lot of like the bus routing and the EQ state, like all of these things are actually recallable instantaneously, as well as fader positions, of course. So
wow.
It's a modern console. It doesn't have, a 10-foot tall rack of power supplies, but it still does generate a lot of heat. And the AC in my space was just substantially underpowered. And it was actually that the Maz session where they had the full band. It was maybe 7 or 8 band members plus 5 or 6 videographers. And it was me and my assistant. And it was just out of control hot. And I was like, I cannot do this anymore. Like my shirt was soaked. Like it was just, I felt miserable. I felt bad because the band was hot and I was hot. And I just said, it's time to like make the AC work in this place properly. And so in order to do that, I really had to do a central AC system because previous to that, the old setup just had a mini split on the walls, as many spaces do. And you can't have that running while you're recording, of course. So if you have a large band or you have, heat generating equipment like the console, it's overwhelmed, and you can't, you can't